These are the people who look into the abyss of our past for a living. They study bones that tell stories of brutal injuries, agonizing diseases, and violent death. They are hardened to the horrors of the ancient world. They thought they had seen it all. This is the image we all have. The strong, resilient survivor. The pinnacle of natural health. It's a lie. A comfortable, romantic lie. Because a new discovery, something found lurking deep within the very bones of our ancestors, has revealed a truth so grotesque, so profoundly disturbing, that it is making the scientists who found it physically sick. This isn't about a tough life. This is about a biological horror story that has been hidden for 40,000 years. And what they found will change everything you think you know about being human. Chapter 1. The skeletons in our closet, a lie we told ourselves. Look around you. It's one of the biggest movements of our time. The paleofantasy. The idea that somewhere deep in our past exists a perfect version of ourselves. The ancestral human. We imagine them as paragons of natural health, their bodies perfectly tuned by evolution, their minds clear and free from the anxieties of the modern world. We see them as strong, lean, resilient beings, living in perfect harmony with nature. We tell ourselves they were free from the diseases of modernity. No diabetes, no heart disease, no chronic inflammation. Their diet, we believe, was the perfect diet: clean protein, healthy fats, natural fruits and vegetables. Their lifestyle was the perfect lifestyle: constant, natural movement, strong community bonds, and a life lived with purpose. We have built an entire industry, a global obsession, around this powerful, romantic image. We've turned the caveman into a health guru. We look at the litany of our own problems, the stress, the sickness, the dissatisfaction, and we look back with a kind of nostalgic yearning for this imagined past. A simpler time. A purer time. A time when we were truly, authentically, and robustly human. We see the caveman not as a primitive ancestor, but as an aspirational goal. The strong, noble survivor. It is a comforting, inspiring, and incredibly powerful story. And it is one of the biggest lies we have ever told ourselves. The truth is not inspiring. It is sickening. Of course, for decades, the scientists who actually study these remains knew that the paleofantasy was nonsense. They knew life wasn't a healthy jog through a pristine forest. The bones have always told a story of brutality. We've seen the evidence etched into their skeletons for 100 years. We've seen the healed and unhealed fractures from brutal falls and violent encounters. We've seen the crippling, degenerative arthritis in the joints of individuals who were barely 30 years old, a testament to a life of grueling physical labor. We've seen the skulls bearing the unmistakable marks of blunt force trauma, evidence of a world of shocking violence. We've diagnosed anemia, malnutrition, and stunted growth directly from their fossilized remains. The old story, the one told by traditional paleontology, was already grim. It was a story of a short, painful, and violent existence, a constant struggle against a hostile world. But even within this grim reality, there was a core assumption that remained unchallenged. The assumption was that our ancestors, while battered and bruised by their environment, were fundamentally healthy. Their bodies were strong, their core biology sound. The threats were all external: the predator in the bushes, the rival clan over the hill, the fall from the cliff, the infection from a dirty wound. We believed the horror was something that happened to them. We never suspected that the greatest horror of all was something they carried inside them. The bones told a story of physical trauma, but they were silent on another kind of suffering. They couldn't show us diseases of the mind. They couldn't show us madness. They couldn't show us the microscopic evidence of a biological curse. We were blind to the truth because we were only looking at the frame of the house, not the poison that had seeped into the very foundations. The story the bones could tell was always incomplete. A skeleton can tell you how a person broke their leg, but it can't tell you if they were slowly losing their mind. It can show you a healed wound, but it can't show you the nature of the disease that might have been raging through their soft tissues. To find that, you need to go deeper. You need a new kind of archaeology. An archaeology of the invisible. This is the world of paleoproteomics. It is a revolutionary new science that is allowing us to do something that was considered science fiction just a decade ago. We can now extract the ghostly remnants of ancient proteins from samples of bone and tooth enamel that are tens of thousands of years old. Proteins are the building blocks of life, the tiny machines that do all the work in our cells. And sometimes they hold the secrets to how a person died and, more importantly, how they lived. Imagine it. A 40,000-year-old fragment of bone, ground into a fine powder. Scientists can now sift through that dust and find the molecular fossils of the proteins that made up that individual's body. It's like finding a single legible word from a book that was burned to ash millennia ago. And by reading these molecular ghosts, scientists have started to piece together a story that traditional archaeology was completely blind to. They started looking for the signatures of common diseases, but they found something else. Something they were not expecting. Something that, at first, they couldn't believe. Lurking in the proteins of these ancient humans, they found the unmistakable chemical signature of a biological nightmare. A disease so horrific, so completely antithetical to our romantic image of our ancestors, that it has sent a shockwave of revulsion through the scientific community. They were looking for a tough life. What they found was a plague of madness. Chapter 2. The Twisted Protein, Uncovering a Plague of Madness. To understand the horror they found, you first need to understand a fundamental process in your own body. Your life is run by proteins. And for a protein to work, it has to be folded into a precise, intricate, three-dimensional shape. Think of it like a key. When it's folded correctly, it fits the lock perfectly and does its job. But what if the key gets bent? This is where the story begins, with a specific type of protein found in the brains of all mammals, including us. It's called a prion protein. When it's folded correctly, it's a normal, harmless part of your brain cells. Its exact function is still a bit of a mystery, but in its proper shape, it is a good citizen of your cellular community. But this protein has a dark secret. A terrifying alter ego. Under certain conditions, it can misfold. It can get bent out of shape. And when it does, it transforms into something monstrous. A misfolded prion protein is no longer a key. It is a biological zombie. It is a tiny, indestructible, infectious agent of chaos. It is, for all intents and purposes, alive, and it has only one mission: to replicate. And it does so in the most horrifying way imaginable. This is the discovery that turned the stomachs of the scientists. Using paleoproteomics, they analyzed the bone dust of Neanderthals and early humans from multiple sites across Europe. And in the faint, ghostly signatures of the proteins that once made up their bodies, they found it. The unmistakable, terrifying chemical footprint of misfolded, pathological prion proteins. The bent keys. The zombies. Our ancestors weren't just fighting lions and bears. They were fighting a plague of rogue proteins that was turning their brains to sponge. This is what makes a prion so terrifying. It is not a virus. It is not a bacteria. It is a traitor from within. Once a single misfolded prion protein exists in the brain, it becomes a template of death. When it touches one of its healthy, properly folded neighbors, it forces that healthy protein to snap into the same misfolded, diseased configuration. Now there are two zombies. Those two then find two healthy proteins and convert them. Now there are 4. Then 8. Then 16. It is a slow, silent, and absolutely relentless chain reaction. An unstoppable cascade of corruption that spreads through the brain, neuron by neuron. As the army of zombie proteins grows, they begin to clump together, forming dense, sticky plaques that clog the machinery of the brain cells. The cells, unable to function, begin to die. The brain, the very seat of consciousness and identity, literally starts to develop holes. It becomes spongy and full of microscopic voids. The clinical term is spongiform encephalopathy. You might know it by another name: mad cow disease. Or in humans, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. The symptoms are the stuff of nightmares. It begins with subtle changes: memory loss, confusion, shifts in personality. But it quickly descends into a waking horror. The victim suffers from dementia, hallucinations, and severe muscle spasms. They lose the ability to walk, to speak, to control their own bodies. In the final stages, they are often plunged into a state of aggression and violent madness before falling into a coma and dying. There is no cure. There is no treatment. It is 100% fatal. This is the disease that was rampant in our ancient ancestors. Now, place this biological horror story back into the Stone Age. Before this discovery, we imagined their struggles, but we never imagined this. We never imagined a world where your own family members, your hunting partners, the people you huddled with for warmth, could be walking time bombs of madness. Imagine watching your brother, one of the strongest hunters in the clan, start to forget his way back to camp. Imagine seeing your mother, who has cared for you your whole life, suddenly unable to recognize you, her eyes filled with a vacant terror. Imagine a member of your group, once calm and reliable, suddenly flying into fits of unprovoked, violent rage, their body racked with spasms you cannot understand. How would they have interpreted this? They had no concept of misfolded proteins. They would have seen it as a spiritual sickness. A curse from an angry god. A possession by a malevolent demon. The victim would become an object of profound fear. Their slow, public descent into gibbering, violent dementia would have been a constant, terrifying spectacle at the heart of the community. The scientific evidence suggests this wasn't a rare, isolated disease. The protein signatures have been found in multiple individuals across different locations and time periods. This indicates that prion disease wasn't a freak occurrence. It was an endemic, persistent, and terrifyingly common feature of their world. The romantic paleo fantasy of a strong, vibrant ancestor collapses in the face of this sickening truth. We must now picture a world not just of physical hardship, but of deep, pervasive psychological horror, where the greatest threat wasn't the monster in the cave, but the monster growing in the mind of the person sleeping next to you. But the most sickening question remains, how? How did this plague of madness spread? Chapter 3. The Cannibal's Feast, the Horrifying Method of Transmission. How does a plague of madness take hold of a species? For a disease to become endemic, for it to persist across generations and geographical locations, it needs a reliable and efficient method of transmission. It needs a pathway from a sick individual to a healthy one. With prion disease, the pathway is horrifyingly direct. The misfolded proteins are not easily destroyed. They can't be killed by cooking. They can't be broken down by stomach acid. They are incredibly resilient. And they are most highly concentrated in the tissues of the central nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, and the eyes. To become infected, you have to consume this diseased tissue. You have to eat the brain of a sick animal. This is how mad cow disease spread to humans, from eating the meat of infected cattle. This is how the disease known as kuru spread among the 4 people of New Guinea, through the ritualistic consumption of their dead relatives' brains. The scientists who found the evidence of prion disease in our ancestors immediately knew what this implied. The conclusion was unavoidable, and it was sickening. The plague of madness wasn't being spread by an insect or a dirty water source. It was being spread by a specific, deliberate, and terrifying act. It was being spread by cannibalism. We have known for decades that our ancient ancestors practiced cannibalism. We have found the bones of Neanderthals and early humans in caves across the world with the same telltale marks of butchery that we find on deer and bison. The skulls are cracked open. The long bones are split down the middle. For a long time we debated the reasons. Was it ritual? Was it warfare? Or was it, as many suspected, simply a matter of survival, a desperate act in a world of constant starvation? This new discovery provides the darkest possible answer. It was survival cannibalism. And in eating the dead to survive the winter, they were unknowingly feeding a nightmare that would rot their own minds. Let's reconstruct the cycle of horror. Imagine a small clan trapped by a brutal winter. The herds have moved on. The plants are buried under a foot of snow. They have been starving for weeks. An elder in the group, already weakened, finally succumbs to the cold. The clan now faces a terrible choice: starve to death or eat. Survival instinct is the most powerful force in nature. They choose to eat. They treat the body of their kinsman as they would any other source of meat. But the most valuable part of any carcass, the most nutrient-dense and calorie-rich part, is the head. With a heavy stone, they crack open the skull to get at the fatty, energy-packed brain. It's a horrifying act, but one born of absolute necessity. It is the act that will save them from starvation. But now let's add the poison. Let's say that the elder who died was in the early asymptomatic stages of prion disease. His brain, while appearing normal, was already riddled with the misfolded, infectious proteins. The clan, by consuming his brain, has just ingested a massive dose of the zombie proteins. For months or even years they will seem fine. The disease incubates, the slow, silent chain reaction building in their own brains. Then one of them, a hunter, starts to show the symptoms. He becomes clumsy, confused, then violent. One day in his madness he falls from a cliff and dies. The clan is once again starving. And once again they eat the dead to survive. But this time they are consuming a brain that is in the full, florid bloom of the disease. They ingest an even more potent dose of the prion. The incubation time gets shorter. The disease becomes more aggressive. This is the cannibal's curse. The very act they perform to survive is the act that condemns them to the same horrifying fate as the person they are eating. This creates a perfect, self-sustaining feedback loop of horror. Every act of survival cannibalism becomes an act of disease transmission. Every death from the prion disease creates a new, highly infectious source of the poison. It is a biological trap from which there is no escape. The more they relied on cannibalism to survive the lean times, the more saturated the population would become with the infectious prion. This discovery recasts the practice of prehistoric cannibalism in a new, even more terrifying light. It was not just a social or moral horror, it was a profound biological blunder. It turned their own bodies into the reservoir for a plague. The very thing they thought was a solution to starvation was actually a long-term curse that would decimate them from within. Think of the brutal irony. The brain, the very organ that gave them the intelligence to survive, to make tools, to build communities, became the vessel of their destruction. The fatty, calorie-rich nature of the brain made it the most prized part of the cannibal's feast. But it was also the most infectious. Their own intelligence, which told them that the brain was the most valuable food, was leading them directly to the source of the poison. The scientists who uncovered this are sickened because it reveals a story of a species trapped in a nightmare of their own making. A story where survival and self-destruction were one and the same. It paints a picture of our ancestors not as noble savages, but as tragic, desperate figures, unknowingly poisoning themselves and their children, propagating a plague of madness every time they tried to cheat starvation. The evidence of cannibalism was always there. But we never realized it was the smoking gun for a much deeper, more insidious horror. Chapter 4. The World of the Damned, a Society Gripped by Fear. Once a plague like this takes hold, it doesn't just kill the body. It murders trust. It poisons the very bonds that hold a society together. With this new discovery, we must now repaint our entire picture of Stone Age life. We must imagine a world steeped not just in physical hardship, but in a constant, corrosive, and deeply personal psychological terror. This was not a society. It was a paranoid asylum, and the inmates were in charge. Forget the idea of a tight-knit, loving clan. Imagine instead a group of individuals bound together by necessity, but constantly watching each other for the first signs of the curse. Every stumble, every forgotten word, every moment of confusion in an elder would be noted, not with compassion, but with a cold, calculating dread. Is it starting? Is he the next one to go? The affection between a parent and a child would be tainted. A mother would watch her child at play, and every clumsy fall would send a spike of fear through her heart. Is that just the clumsiness of youth, or is it the beginning of the jerky, uncoordinated movements of the disease? The love for her child would be at war with the terrifying fear of what it might become. The social fabric would be shredded. Alliances would be fragile. The person you hunted with yesterday, the one you trusted to watch your back, could be tomorrow's babbling, violent monster. The concept of long-term planning, of community, of a shared future, would be almost impossible to maintain when you lived with the constant, gnawing uncertainty that half your clan could be carrying a dormant plague of madness in their heads. It is a world without true peace, a world where the monster wears the face of your mother, your brother, your child. How does a society deal with a threat that looks like its own members? They would have no choice but to become cruel. The moment an individual's symptoms became undeniable, the violent spasms, the aggressive outbursts, the loss of recognition, they would cease to be a person. They would become a threat. An object of pure horror that had to be contained. There would be no concept of caregiving for the mentally ill. The risk would be too great. The victim, in their violent thrashing, could injure someone. In their madness, they might wander off and attract predators to the camp. They were a liability that had to be managed. The most likely outcome would be a brutal form of quarantine. The afflicted would be driven out of the camp, banished to die alone in the wilderness. Or perhaps they would be sealed into a small cave, left with no food or water, their distant screams a terrifying reminder to the clan of the fate that could await them all. And what about the act that spreads the disease? The cannibalism itself. It would become a necessary act shrouded in the deepest terror and taboo. They knew, on some level, that it was connected to the sickness. They must have seen the pattern. We eat the dead and then we become sick like the dead. But starvation is a more immediate threat than a disease that might take years to manifest. So they would do it. They would perform the horrifying act, but they would do so with the full knowledge that they might be swallowing their own doom. It would become a desperate, cursed ritual. Perhaps they would try to mitigate the risk, avoiding the head, even though it was the most nutritious part. But in times of true desperate starvation, that rule would be broken. They would be forced to choose the curse just to survive one more season. It is a society caught in a cycle of calculated, terrified self-destruction. This plague would have had devastating consequences for the entire species. The constant, internal rot of prion disease would have kept population numbers catastrophically low. It would have been a massive check on their ability to grow and expand. But even more damaging was how it would have affected their interactions with other groups. If you were constantly terrified of your own family members turning into monsters, how would you view strangers? You would see them as vectors of disease. Another clan wandering into your territory wouldn't just be a competitor for resources. They would be a walking plague, a potential carrier of the madness. The impulse would not be curiosity or trade. The impulse would be extermination. This discovery may help explain a long-standing mystery: why Neanderthals, despite being intelligent and incredibly tough, ultimately failed. This endemic prion disease could have been their great filter. It made their societies paranoid and fragile from within, and violently xenophobic from without. It prevented them from forming the larger social networks, the wider alliances, that our own species, Homo sapiens, used to eventually conquer the planet. Their world was damned. They were trapped on a dying branch of the human family tree, not just by climate change or competition, but by a sickening curse of their own making. This wasn't a world of noble survivors. It was a world of broken minds, fractured societies, and pervasive, gnawing fear. A world where the most terrifying possibility was that the person you were talking to was already, silently, turning into a monster, and you might be next. The scientists are sickened because this discovery transforms our ancestors from tragic heroes into the protagonists of a biological horror story of the highest order. Chapter 5. The Ghost in Our Genes, The Warning Left Behind. It would be easy to close this chapter of our history, to file it away as a uniquely Neanderthal horror story. It would be comforting to think that this plague of madness died out with them, that this was their curse alone. But it isn't. The ghost of this ancient plague doesn't just live in the dust of their bones. It lives on, silent and dormant, inside of you. It is written into your own genetic code. Scientists have known for some time about a specific gene, the prion protein gene, PRNP, that codes for the very prion proteins we've been discussing. What's fascinating and deeply revealing is that this gene is incredibly diverse across the human population. There are many different variations or polymorphisms of this one gene. And for years scientists wondered why. Why would a single gene have so many different flavors? Normally, high diversity in a gene suggests that it's been under intense evolutionary pressure. Something was messing with this gene for a very long time. Now we know what it was. This genetic diversity is a scar. It is the molecular evidence of an ancient arms race between our ancestors and the prion plague. A study of the PRNP gene in modern humans from all over the world revealed a stunning fact. A specific genetic variation, one known to offer significant resistance to prion diseases like Kuru and Creutzfeldt-Jakob, is incredibly, almost unnaturally, common. The only way for a protective gene variant to become this widespread is if the disease it protects against was once so rampant, so deadly, that it killed off a huge portion of the population who didn't have the protective gene. The prion plague wasn't just a Neanderthal problem. It was a human problem. It was a great filter that our own ancestors had to pass through, and the only survivors were the ones who carried this lucky genetic quirk. This is a chilling thought. This wasn't a localized epidemic. For this protective gene to be found in populations from Europe, to Asia, to Africa, to the Americas, it means one of two things. Either the prion plague, driven by cannibalism, was a truly global pandemic that raged for tens of thousands of years, or our species was bottlenecked through a small, prion-resistant population that survived and then repopulated the world. Either way, the implication is staggering. A huge portion of our ancient ancestors, our own Homo sapiens relatives, were wiped out by this plague of madness. We survived because of a mutation. A lucky roll of the genetic dice. Some of our ancestors were born with a version of the prion protein gene that made their brain proteins slightly less susceptible to being hijacked by the zombie prion. In a world free of the disease, this mutation would have been meaningless. But in a world saturated with it, it was the ultimate evolutionary advantage. While their neighbors descended into madness, these lucky few were spared. They survived. They had children. And they passed on their genetic resistance. Generation after generation, the gene for susceptibility was weeded out of the human gene pool in the most brutal way possible. We are the descendants of the resistant. The very fact that you are here, able to watch this, is because your distant ancestors had the right mutation to survive a world gone mad. The ghost of the cannibal's feast is carried in your blood. It is a silent testament to the horror that our species endured and the mass death that it took to overcome it. This new discovery isn't just about how a few cavemen died. It's about why you are alive. And the threat is not entirely gone. Prion diseases are still with us. They are incredibly rare now, but they still surface like ancient monsters rising from the deep. Every case of sporadic CJD, a person who develops the disease with no known cause, is a terrifying echo of this ancient plague. It's a reminder that the potential for our own proteins to betray us, to turn into those monstrous, twisted shapes, never truly went away. This discovery is so sickening to scientists because it shatters our most cherished illusions about the past and forces us to confront some deeply uncomfortable truths about the present. It destroys the fantasy of the paleo ideal, replacing it with a reality of madness and self-destruction. It reveals that cannibalism wasn't just a fringe activity, but a practice common enough to drive a species-altering pandemic. But most of all, it's sickening because it's a story about us. It's a warning written in our own DNA. It tells us that our minds are fragile things, susceptible to a horrifying biological breakdown. It reminds us that we are the descendants of people who were forced to do the unthinkable to survive, and that they paid a terrible price for it. The line between survival and self-destruction, between sanity and madness, has always been terrifyingly thin. We are the survivors of a plague of madness, and we carry the ghosts of the fallen, and the ghost of the disease itself, inside us to this very day. It's a lot to process, isn't it? To think that our own DNA is a history book that tells a story of a cannibal's curse and a plague of madness. It certainly makes you look at our human story a little differently. It's a reminder that the neat, heroic tales we like to tell ourselves often hide a much darker and more complex truth. What part of this discovery do you find the most unsettling? The idea of the disease itself, the fact that it was spread by cannibalism, or the realization that its legacy is still in our genes? This is a heavy topic, and I'm very interested to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you appreciate these deeper, sometimes darker, explorations of our human past, make sure to subscribe and ring that bell. We believe in telling the whole story, not just the comfortable parts. Thank you for taking this journey with us into one of the most sickening and most important discoveries ever made about who we really are.